Welcome to the Introduction to SNOMED CT tutorial. My name is Spiers and I will be your presenter for the first part of this tutorial, after which my colleague Liara will then present the second part. Today we're going to present a number of SNOMED CT topics. Firstly, what is SNOMED CT? Then a brief introduction to SNOMED International and delve into some of the key features of SNOMED CT. We will discuss how SNOMED CT can be customized. And finally, Liara will discuss SNOMED CT benefits and how you could learn more about SNOMED CT. So let's start with what is SNOMED CT. In the last 2 decades, there have been great advancements in digital systems to meet the needs of all healthcare professionals in performing their daily tasks. The key component of these systems is the electronic health record, which improves communication and increases the availability of relevant and critical clinical information. For an electronic health record to function at its optimum level, it requires the use of an up-to-date and comprehensive clinical terminology. As the most comprehensive clinical terminology in use around the world, the implementation and adoption of SNOMED CT in healthcare systems globally enables a multitude of benefits. SNOMED CT is currently used in more than 80 countries, and this number is continuously growing. The increasing use of SNOMED CT across the world is showing the fantastic possibilities and benefits of SNOMED CT in enhancing interoperability, the effective sharing of clinical information. Let's now examine more about SNOMED CT. SNOMED CT supports the consistent recording, retrieval, sharing, and analysis of clinical data. As you can see on this slide, healthcare information is recorded in electronic health records for many purposes, including when a subject is given a diagnosis, when a procedure is performed on the subject, such as an operation, when medication is prescribed, and when specific tests are requested. A system user would not only require the need to record such data, but also to effectively retrieve, share, and analyze the data. SNOMED CT is a comprehensive clinical terminology which has been designed to meet these user requirements. We will see how SNOMED CT supports these requirements throughout this tutorial. SNOMED CT is not just a coding system of diagnosis. In fact, it covers a broad scope of clinical meanings that are relevant for recording in clinical records. This means it also covers other types of clinical findings like signs and symptoms. It includes surgical, therapeutic, and diagnostic procedures. And it includes the observations which clinicians may perform. SNOMED CT also includes content representing body structures, organisms, substances, pharmaceutical products, physical objects, physical forces, specimens, and many other types of information that may need to be recorded in or around the health or care record. SNOMED CT is a global terminology. The comprehensive scope of SNOMED CT reduces the need to support multiple incompatible and overlapping code systems. This means SNOMED CT can be implemented as the common terminology for consistent communication, retrieval, and processing across clinical specialities and between healthcare facilities at local, national, and international levels. The international release currently has more than 350,000 unique concepts in 19 top-level hierarchies. SNOMED CT content can be updated with new concepts and changes or inactivations of existing concepts. It has a history mechanism, which is a log-style append-only data model to track all changes to each component, providing full traceability. Originally, SNOMED was released every 6 months, but now it is released more frequently, so the terminology can continuously adapt to current practice and keep up with changes in medical knowledge. You can use SNOMED CT to record at the level of detail a clinician or speciality requires. Different levels of detail relevant to the stage in the clinical journey can be captured. For example, at the first visit, impaired social interaction may be recorded. Then once the assessment is completed, autism spectrum disorder may be recorded. This allows analysis at different levels. SNOMED CT has been designed from the experience and knowledge of past clinical terminologies. SNOMED CT was first released in 2002 by the College of American Pathologists. The first release contained a merger of the content of earlier versions of SNOMED and the read codes. The design of SNOMED was based on identified user requirements, practical experience, and scientific principles established in peer-reviewed publications. SNOMED was acquired by the International Health Terminology Standards Development Organization, IHTSDO, for the public good in 2007. In 2017, IHTSDO adopted the trade name SNOMED International. In 1998, Dr. James Cimino published a paper, Desiderata for Controlled Clinical Vocabularies in the 21st Century, in which he set out the 12 requirements for future clinical terminologies. These requirements were driven by the need to represent meaningful information in a consistent, processable, and permanent way, while also enabling continual improvement and addition. Just over a year later, the desiderata were adopted as 12 of the 15 agreed requirements for the design of SNOMED CT. The other requirements related to international scope, support for translation, and practical implementability. SNOMED CT also has a logic-based design based on description logic. SNOMED CT is not just a code system. It represents clinical ideas in a structure based on the meaning of these clinical ideas. It does this by using definitional relationships, linking different components within SNOMED CT. This structuring is based on a pre-defined set of rules using description logic. These logical relationships allow computer systems to conduct meaning-based processing of SNOMED CT encoded data. And this is useful for many reasons, including supporting system alerts, protocols, analysis, decision support, and knowledge linkage. However, it's not just about what happens inside computer systems. As you'll be aware, healthcare professionals can refer to clinical ideas by different names or terms or abbreviations. SNOMED CT enables multiple human-readable terms to be used for a clinical idea, which could include different languages. How all this links together using the SNOMED CT components of concepts, descriptions, and relationships that you see on this slide will be explained later in this tutorial. SNOMED CT has quality assured, clinically relevant content that is regularly updated. SNOMED International ensures a quality approach to SNOMED through using personnel, including experienced authors with clinical backgrounds across varied domains, and technical experts who manage product release and quality assurance processes. Also through publishing guidance and education material, for example, editorial and mapping guidelines. Processes used include automated rules validation and pattern evaluation, and through collaboration with subject matter expert groups, stakeholders, and other standards bodies. SNOMED International engages in processes to undertake broader examination across all hierarchies. Through its quality initiative, it adopts a greater focus on correcting structural anomalies as well as modification of content, resulting in a higher level of clinical accuracy. There are maps from SNOMED CT to a number of international standards. Here are some examples of SNOMED CT maps to international standards. The International Classification of Diseases ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases for Oncology ICD-0, and the Global Medical Device Nomenclature GMDN. These maps are released by SNOMED International and are created by specialist mappers who have domain knowledge of the source and target of these maps. Local codes and free text can also be mapped to SNOMED CT where appropriate by owners of this data in accordance with license agreements. Mapping between code systems has many advantages, including enabling cross-domain queries and analysis. So as you can see, SNOMED CT can act as a bridge between code systems. SNOMED CT can be configured to meet specific user requirements. For example, a national extension may be created by a member country that requires its own specific national content or descriptions in a specific language to be added. This has already been achieved by many of SNOMED International member countries. An example is Australia has its own national extension and Sweden has a Swedish language version of SNOMED CT. Published SNOMED International and country-specific content can be visualized in the SNOMED CT browser. How SNOMED CT features can be extended to meet specific requirements through extensions, reference sets, and language preferences will be covered briefly later in this tutorial. I'd like to now talk briefly about SNOMED International. SNOMED International is a not-for-profit standards organisation. It owns and maintains SNOMED CT on behalf of and in partnership with its 41 member countries. SNOMED International is owned, governed and funded by its member countries. Member fees are based on national wealth. SNOMED CT is free for use in member countries, and there are modest fees to use SNOMED CT in non-member countries. SNOMED International's vision for the next 5 years is, by 2025, clinical terminologies will be used globally, which will result in better health and patient outcomes, supported by one language of health. This slide lists the current memberships of SNOMED International. Currently there are 41 member countries. Membership has grown steadily from an initial group of 9 members and is continuing to grow, with many more countries expressing strong interest in joining the organisation. SNOMED CT is an international standard that has had thousands of hours of clinical expertise gone into developing and maintaining the standard. A clinical terminology like this would be almost impossible to replicate in a cost-effective way, so there is a huge advantage in leveraging this existing resource. Memberships offer many benefits. For example, member countries get free use of SNOMED CT and related products. Membership allows country representatives to be part of the General Assembly and participate in other meetings and forums. And while SNOMED CT is an international standard, members have the permission to create their own national extensions and translations of SNOMED CT. New members are offered free member inductions. Also, a number of member education benefits exist. For example, anyone who resides in a member country receives access to free courses and 50% discount on certifications. Member countries also get 2 free certification enrollments per year. Now, let's move on to talk about the design and the features of SNOMED CT. For those of you who have never been introduced to SNOMED CT before, there are three basic components you need to know about to understand the fundamentals of SNOMED CT. These components are the concepts, the descriptions, and the relationships. Firstly, concepts. A concept is a clinical idea that has a unique meaning and has a unique identifier. So in this example, the doctor is thinking about this clinical idea, and in this case, a heart attack. So this is what we call a concept. It's a clinical idea in the head of a clinician that has a unique identifier, which, by the way, cannot change over time. Next, let's explain descriptions. Descriptions are the human readable terms that are associated with these clinical ideas. In healthcare, there are often different ways of saying the same clinical idea. Here we have myocardial infarction. This is often also known as heart attack or a cardiac infarction. So, there are many ways of saying the same clinical idea. These descriptions, as you can imagine, could also be in different languages, as long as they mean the same clinical idea. There are two main types of descriptions. The first one, the fully specified name, is the description that uniquely captures the meaning of the clinical idea. All the remaining descriptions are known as synonyms. Descriptions also have a unique identifier, as you can see. As we stated earlier, SNOMED CT covers a wide range of clinical information that may need to be recorded in or around a health record. This slide shows the top-level hierarchies in SNOMED CT. All SNOMED CT concepts sit in one of these top-level hierarchies. These hierarchies provide a way of organizing the concepts in SNOMED CT, so it's important to have an understanding of how this is done. This slide shows how concepts are linked together in a hierarchy with subtype relationships. Here you can see myocardial infarction has an ISA relationship to myocardial disease, which means myocardial infarction is a type of or subtype of myocardial disease. Acute myocardial infarction has an ISA relationship to myocardial infarction, which means it's a subtype of myocardial infarction. These are often described as parent and child concepts. At the top of the hierarchy is the root concept, and all concepts are descendants of this concept. All concepts have at least one ISA relationship and can have more than one ISA relationship. Below the root concept sits the top-level hierarchy concepts, in this case clinical finding. Concepts get more and more specific as we go down the hierarchy, with the most specific concept at the bottom. So relationships are what connects SNOMED CT concepts together, and there are different types of relationships. First of all, we have the ISA relationship, as illustrated on the previous slide in a hierarchical view. If we take a more detailed look at myocardial infarction, it actually has 4 ISA relationships to different parents. Myocardial infarction is a type of ischemic heart disease, a type of myocardial disease, a type of myocardial necrosis, and a type of necrosis of anatomical site within the SNOMED CT structure. These multiple ISA relationships form what is known as a polyhierarchical structure. Aside from ISA relationships, we also have other relationship types, attribute relationships, which allow us to specify defining characteristics of SNOMED CT concepts. And these attribute relationship types help to define the meaning of a concept. So in this particular case, we have the concept myocardial infarction, and it has a finding site relationship to the myocardial structure. This concept is from the body structure hierarchy. Each relationship is actually a triple of three concepts. There's the source concept, which is the one being defined. In this case, it's myocardial infarction. Next is the attribute concept, which in this case is finding site, which helps to tell you what type of relationship it is. And finally, there is the attribute value, which in this case is myocardium structure. There's another attribute relationship for myocardial infarction. It has an associated morphology relationship to infarct, which is a concept from the morphological abnormality hierarchy. The next feature that I will introduce to you is the SNOMED CT concept model. The concept model defines the rules for how SNOMED CT concepts can be defined. So for each attribute or relationship type, such as finding site, it defines the permitted source concepts, which is called the domain, and the permitted target concepts, which is called the range of the attribute. So if we look at the attribute finding site, this attribute specifies the body site that is affected by a disease or a condition. The domain of the finding site is the set of clinical findings. This means that finding site can only be applied to concepts that are a subtype of clinical finding, and the range of finding site is the set of anatomical or acquired body structure. This means that the value of a finding site must be a subtype of anatomical or acquired body structure. So for example, if we consider the relationship fracture of bone has a finding site bone structure, this relationship satisfies this concept model rule because fracture of bone, the source concept, is a subtype of clinical finding and therefore in the correct domain, and bone structure, which is the value for the target concept, is a subtype of anatomical or acquired body structure and therefore in the correct range. As SNOMED CT uses description logic, relationships between concepts can be inferred. For example, let's look at how fracture of femur is modelled in SNOMED CT. Fracture of femur is a fracture of the lower limb, and fracture of lower limb is a fracture of bone. Fracture of femur can also have inferred relationships, i.e. relationships that are not stated but because of logical definition can be inferred. So it can be inferred that fracture of femur is a relationship to fracture of bone. Also, because fracture of bone is a relationship to the next higher level concept, which in turn is a relationship to its next higher level concept, a pattern that is repeated all the way up the hierarchy to disease, it can be inferred that fracture of bone is a relationship to disease. Likewise, fracture of femur and fracture of lower limb have is a relationship to disease. So inference allows us to state that fracture of bone, fracture of femur, and fracture of lower limb are all types of disease. Inference allows a lower level concept to be a type of any of its higher level concepts which it has is a relationship pathway to. This is extremely useful when you want to state which concepts are descendants of a particular concept. This powerful feature is often used when performing analysis or used when expressing a set of concepts as a high-level concept and all its descendants. For example, fracture of bone and all its descendants could be used to search for whether a subject has had any type of bone fracture. A good way of searching on and viewing all the SNOMED CT concepts, descriptions and relationships is using the SNOMED CT browser. In this example, you can see the concept viral pneumonia, its descriptions, and its SNOMED CT concept ID. As you can see, the concept has two parent concepts, infective pneumonia and viral lower respiratory infection. You can also view viral pneumonia's attribute relationships that are used to further define the meaning of the concept. The browser also shows that viral pneumonia has 15 direct descendants, children that are all types of viral pneumonia. Some of these concepts also have their own descendants. The browser also allows you to view a concept in a diagrammatic form. Here you can see the concept viral pneumonia once more and all its defining relationships. Now we have talked about the big three, the concepts, descriptions, and relationships. I will move on to talk about the features of SNOMED CT that allow us to customize SNOMED CT to meet specific requirements. The next really useful feature of SNOMED CT that is worth understanding is the ability to create extensions. The international release currently has more than 350,000 unique concepts in 19 top-level hierarchies that are useful across multiple countries and healthcare systems. However, SNOMED CT is designed to allow the international edition to be enhanced by adding additional content that is required for local use, to meet the needs of countries, specialities and realms, to meet vendor needs, or to meet local business needs. This additional content is added into a SNOMED CT extension. Extensions may include both local components, so that means additional concepts, relationships or descriptions that are required locally, and also local reference sets to define local subsets, language preferences, and maps between SNOMED CT and local code systems. Every extension must have at least one authorized namespace, which is created and managed by SNOMED International. The namespace is used when creating new SNOMED CT identifiers in an extension to ensure that these identifiers are not just unique locally, but they're also unique globally. Here is an example of a concept identifier from an extension. The digits shown in red are the namespace identifier, and this helps to ensure that these local extension identifiers are globally unique. The next feature of SNOMED CT that we're going to look at is the reference set. A reference set is a mechanism for representing references to SNOMED CT components to support a variety of different requirements, including defining a subset of SNOMED CT concepts. This may be to limit a search list or perform message data validation. A reference set can be used to specify language preferences by indicating which descriptions are preferred and acceptable in a particular dialect, region, or context. Reference sets can also be used to define the display order in a search list, to create alternative navigational hierarchies to make data entry easier, to create alternative aggregation hierarchies to support analysis for a specific use case, to add annotations about each reference component, and to map SNOMED CT components to and from another code system. Over the next few slides, we will look at three of the most common uses of reference sets: subsets, language preferences, and maps. A subset is a collection of components for a particular purpose. Here you see a set of 3 description components and their associated terms in the international edition of SNOMED CT. Common cold, influenza, and viral tonsillitis, all members in one subset. The bottom table shows how to represent this subset as a simple reference set. And as you can see, the identifier for each subset member is applied to the reference component ID of a ref set. So this means that the 3 concepts represented by the reference component IDs are all members of the same simple reference set. This reference set is versioned and can be published for sharing with the wider community. Subsets can be used for a number of purposes, including for searches and data entry. For example, restricting searches to a set of concepts or descriptions, or specifying descriptions to appear in a list of options, or constraining data entry to a specified set of concepts. Subsets could be used for the information model and communications, for example, specifying value sets for particular data items. They could be used for data retrieval and analysis, for example, specifying query criteria. Subsets can be used for any purpose that requires selective inclusion or exclusion of specified sets of components. And now we will look at 2 different ways in which a subset can be represented: extensional and intentional. Firstly, if a subset definition is extensional, that means that its membership is defined by enumeration, or in other words, by listing the individual members, like the example on the slide for different patient appearances. Extensionally defined subsets of SNOMED CT components consist of a list of SNOMED CT component identifiers. Most SNOMED CT subsets are defined extensionally using simple reference sets. Reference sets can also be used to specify intentional subsets. If a subset definition is intentional, that means that it is defined using a query and membership is computed by executing that query. In SNOMED CT, query specification reference sets can be used to represent the intentional definitions of subsets of SNOMED CT components. So in this case, membership is defined by a set of rules, and the rules are expressed as a query that computes the reference set members. Queries use SNOMED CT's expression constraint language, which is a formal syntax for representing SNOMED CT expression constraints. On this slide, a query has been expressed in the SNOMED CT's expression constraint language, which states include all descendant concepts of disorder of lung, which has an associated morphology of edema. Using this query, a list of concepts can be computed that meet this criteria. For example, acute respiratory distress syndrome. If we now look at descriptions and language preferences, in SNOMED CT, each description has additional information on what type of description it is, whether a fully specified name or a synonym. The fully specified name represents a unique, unambiguous description of a concept's meaning. The fully specified name is not intended to be displayed in clinical records, but is instead used to disambiguate the distinct meaning of each different concept. Each concept can have only one fully specified name in each language or dialect. As you can see here, the concept with a fully specified name of myocardial infarction disorder in the international release can have different language fully specified names in different language reference sets. Here we highlight fully specified names for the Netherlands language reference set and the Canada French language reference set. A synonym represents a term that can be used to display or select a concept. A concept may have several synonyms. This allows users of SNOMED CT to use the terms they prefer to refer to for a specific clinical meaning. Illustrated here are some of the synonyms in the international release for this concept, as well as the Netherlands language reference set and Canada French language reference set. This slide illustrates how descriptions may be marked preferred or acceptable in one language. Looking at the US language reference set example here, it has one fully specified name, myocardial infarction disorder. Three of the concept synonyms, myocardial infarction, heart attack, and cardiac infarction, are also shown. In a language reference set, it is also possible to distinguish between types of synonyms. One synonym may be marked as preferred, in this case, myocardial infarction. This is known as the preferred term, and is a word or phrase commonly used by clinicians to name that concept. In each language, dialect, or context of use, one and only one synonym can be marked as preferred. Any number of other synonyms that are valid in a language, dialect, or context of use can be marked as acceptable. As you can see here, other descriptions describing the same SNOMED CT concept may be marked preferred or acceptable in another language. Another common use of reference sets is to represent a map between SNOMED CT and an external code system. A map is a specified link from one coding system to another code system. Maps represent the relationships between the codes in each of the code systems involved, which may be simple code systems, terminologies, or classifications. This could be a map from SNOMED CT to a classification, or a map from a local code system to SNOMED CT to support a data migration activity. Here is an example of a map from SNOMED to ICD-0 oncology codes. This particular map is represented as a simple one-to-one map. However, other types of maps can also be represented using reference sets, which allow additional information such as mapping rules and different correlations between the map source and the map target.
Thanks, Ian. And now I would like to provide an overview of value that SNOMED CT offers to various stakeholders. The pathway to realizing the full value of SNOMED CT is when it is embedded in a computer system, typically a clinical information system, or it can be health and data analytics platform or interoperability solution. Conversely, these same systems also need terminologies like SNOMED CT to function effectively. Used within these solutions, SNOMED CT supports data entry and integration, clinical information sharing, point-of-care analytics, population analytics, management analytics, and research users. Key to this discussion are the stakeholders specific to SNOMED CT and the key stakeholder groups that obtain value from the terminology and its use in clinical information systems, health data platforms, and interoperability solutions. Understanding how different stakeholders obtain value from SNOMED CT is essential in determining their specific value propositions. Our core stakeholders include our members, patients and citizens, care providers, researchers, and knowledge producers, policymakers, vendors, implementers, and collaboration partners. The first group of stakeholders to mention here are the SNOMED International members. Members of SNOMED International can be an agency of a national government or another body such as corporation or regional government agency endorsed by an appropriate national government authority within the territory it represents. Members hold the national license for SNOMED CT, making the clinical terminology free for use in their respective countries. The national licensing of SNOMED CT allows members to ensure that high-quality clinical information is available to all stakeholders. SNOMED CT is easily accessible and free to use within member countries for a wide variety of patient care, system management, analytics, and research purposes. Members have full access to the SNOMED CT product set, including regular updates, translation or localization assistance, as well as education and tooling to support local implementers. Finally, members can impact the future direction of SNOMED CT by being fully engaged in SNOMED International activities, requesting and prioritizing changes to SNOMED CT product, and by interacting with other member countries through forums, expos, and other events. Next are the SNOMED International collaboration partners, who provide best-in-class clinical knowledge, classifications, and interoperability solutions to extend the value of SNOMED CT. SNOMED International works with a range of collaboration partners to refine, extend, and integrate the SNOMED CT product within their own expertise, classification schemes, and standards, and together create one language of health, which is of immense value to all stakeholders. Researchers and knowledge producers take the data from clinical information systems, and by using SNOMED CT embedded health data and analytics platforms, they create information, evidence, and knowledge that is used by policymakers, care providers, patients, and other stakeholders for their respective decision-making. Leveraging the unique power of clinical concepts and defining relationships, SNOMED CT helps researchers and knowledge producers integrate other classification schemes and quickly create data, information, evidence, and knowledge. These artifacts can then support point-of-care analytics, population analytics, management analytics, as well as research to benefit the decision-making of policymakers, care providers, patients, and other stakeholders. Using SNOMED CT also allows researchers to accelerate the publication of their research and the actioning of their findings. Next are the implementers of clinical information systems, health data and analytics platforms. Implementers use SNOMED CT to ensure that policymakers, care providers, patients, and other stakeholders can all leverage the high-quality clinical data for patient care, self-care, analytics, research and management decision-making purposes. SNOMED CT enables implementers to deploy the most comprehensive, scientifically validated healthcare terminology available globally. Implementers work closely with vendors and care providers to support the adoption and use of SNOMED CT during the deployment of clinical information systems and health data and analytics platforms. SNOMED CT allows implementers to collect data once and reuse it for a diverse range of clinical, analytical, and research purposes, as well as enabling them to support the information needs of a variety of stakeholders. Next is vendors of clinical information systems, or health data and analytics platforms. Vendors provide state-of-the-art clinical information systems, data analytics platforms, or interoperability solutions to support care providers and patients and citizens throughout the patient journey, as well as researchers and knowledge producers in their analytics and research activities. SNOMED helps vendors open up global markets and expand market share by enhancing the information quality and interoperability in their clinical information systems. SNOMED CT enables vendors to implement a stable, multilingual, quality-assured clinical terminology with a consistent release cycle that allows clinical data to be entered once but used many times. SNOMED CT allows vendors to more easily enhance their products with analytics features so they can support the highest growth segment in the clinical information systems and health data platforms markets. Next is care providers, who deliver clinical evaluations and interventions throughout the patient journey to achieve improved patient outcomes. Developed by clinicians, SNOMED CT helps care providers access a more comprehensive source of high-quality patient information and evidence to improve patient outcomes. When embedded in clinical information systems with point-of-care and population analytics, SNOMED enhances the quality and timeliness of the clinical data that is available to care providers to make patient care decisions. Furthermore, care providers can more easily share clinical information and documents with both the extended healthcare team and patients, both locally and across borders. Patients and citizens are also an important stakeholder group in the SNOMED CT landscape. SNOMED CT helps patients and citizens achieve better health by being more knowledgeable about their health and their self-care options. Through an informed and collaborative decision-making relationship with their care providers, patients can also select the best option for care. Furthermore, SNOMED CT embedded clinical information systems allow the patient's or citizen's clinical information to be shared into a personal health record or viewed by the patient to support patient information empowerment, patient information sharing with their care provider, patient self-care, and health record portability. Policymakers provide direction and management oversight of a healthcare system. They can achieve improvements in the net benefits that SNOMED CT embedded information systems and data platforms provide. Using SNOMED CT accelerates the data analysis and decision-making process for policymakers. Decisions about funding, programs, services, procedures, treatments, and health system use, so that patient outcomes and health system value can be improved. Policymakers rely on researchers and knowledge producers to undertake the population and management analytics and the research necessary to support them, making more informed policy and management decisions. Let's close out the tutorial by exploring some of the resources which are available to those looking to learn more about SNOMED CT. SNOMED International hosts an e-learning platform where we offer several formal courses, both tutored and self-guided, as well as learning pathways which have been designed to allow students to tailor their learning to their individual needs. Our courses teach you SNOMED CT knowledge and skills through online presentations, practical exercises, assignments, tutorials, and assessments. People who are new to SNOMED or those with a general interest might be interested to take the foundation course, which is one of our formal offerings. This course provides an introduction to a broad range of SNOMED-related topics, including what, why, and how of SNOMED CT. And then we also have several advanced courses. The implementation course, which provides an in-depth understanding of SNOMED CT specific knowledge and skills that are required to implement SNOMED in embedded systems. The course starts every year, January and July. The Authoring Level 1 course, which teaches you to have the knowledge and skills needed to perform basic SNOMED CT authoring tasks and prepares you for the certification exam. This course is offered every March and September. We currently also are running a pilot of Authoring Level 2 course. And lastly, the Terminology Services course and certification that teaches you the principles of using SNOMED CT Terminology Server to both search and retrieve SNOMED CT content. In terms of the learning pathways, we have SNOMED CT for developers, analysts, and clinicians. And for more information about these educational opportunities, please refer to the link on this slide. The SNOMED CT document library is another tool you can use to learn about adopting, authoring, implementing, deploying, or using SNOMED. Many of the e-learning presentations mentioned earlier are based on more detailed documents from our library. Documents in this library are organized by category. For example, we have overviews, which give you general idea and information about SNOMED. We also have guides, which offer guidance on specific topics. For example, SNOMED CT in Analytics or SNOMED CT Tutorial Guide. And we also have specifications, which tend to be more technical documents. For example, the release file specification or SNOMED CT compositional grammar. The library is hosted on a web-based platform called Confluence, which provides a convenient mechanism to navigate the library. For those that prefer to read documents offline, they are also offered in a printable PDF format. The document library can be located on the link provided here, and we encourage you to explore this free resource. In addition to updating and releasing SNOMED CT, SNOMED International also provides support to the community. It provides customer and stakeholder relationship management, clinical and vendor engagement programs, collaboration support for our members, and a website for all up-to-date information and regular communications. SNOMED International encourages collaboration with the broader community. So how can you get involved? We would recommend getting involved through groups. The organization hosts online environments that allows collaboration and communication, which is particularly relevant for advisory, project, and reference groups. For example, we have clinical reference groups, which provide framework to facilitate discussion between clinicians focused on a specific clinical specialty or topic area. We also have a vendor marketplace where vendors of SNOMED CT can exchange business information with potential purchasers, which is an important part of encouraging and promoting uptake of SNOMED. There are also opportunities to get involved locally through the member organizations. One can also attend events. We host Expo and 2 business meetings every year. There are also regular webinars. For example, the Clinical Web Series is a collection of webinars where clinicians working with SNOMED share their real-world experiences. The Research Web Series is a collection of webinars presented by distinguished researchers from the SNOMED CT community. And the Implementation Web Series has a goal to enable discussion on implementation best practices and user perspectives about SNOMED implementation. SNOMED International meetings can be found on our website under the section What's on this week. And lastly, SNOMED International has a number of communication channels, including the website, help desk, email, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And that brings us to the conclusion of this tutorial. Those interested in learning more about SNOMED CT or the topics we explored as part of this presentation should refer to the links provided on this slide. On behalf of SNOMED International, we would like to thank you for your time. We will now welcome any questions or comments you may have.
Welcome to the introduction.
Hello, thank you for submitting your questions. We will take them in turn. We will start with a question from Matthias Sotu about the process for how a country can become a member. And additional part of that question was, can a company become a member of SNOMED CT? So for the member country to become, for the country to become a member, we would encourage the relevant people to contact us either directly to the relevant regional customer relations lead or through our fresh desk, help desk, which is info@snomed.org. And we will discuss and explain the process that needs to be fulfilled, which involves application forms as well as clarifying the nomination of the relevant organization. So with regards to companies generally have affiliate licenses for using SNOMED CT. However, if the national agency of the country decides to nominate another organization to represent its interests with SNOMED International, that is the decision of the national government. So there may be precedents put forward for that consideration, but that would need to be done by the government agency or the relevant government. Okay, and my colleague Ian will take the next question.
Okay, so we have a question here about is it possible to run multiple national extensions side by side? We're a company that works across the UK and the US and want to include concepts that are both in the national extensions, but are aware that may be contradictions. So it really depends on the product. So if you're providing a product for the UK, then you want to obviously include the UK extension. And if your product's for the US, you want to include the US extension. I don't think there would be a need for a product that would require to use both at the same time. But the commonality between the extensions will be that you'll also have the SNOMED International release. So you can use that as a commonality between the two extensions, but the extensions might be different because they meet the local needs of the particular member countries. So there will be differences between those, and if you're doing mapping or if you're working, then you'll have to work on each product separately to take into account the differences. Just looking to see if there's other questions. So we have a question here. Please can you explain the intentional versus the extensional? So the difference is that one is a enumerated list, so it's basically a list of concepts, where the other one, it enables you to have something like a query, and from that you apply that to the substrate, so whichever release you're using, and it will create the subset for you in those given rules. So you could have, say for example, all types of lung disease and all its children, and that would then create the subset for you. So the difference is one's just a list that everything is listed down, and the other one is where you computationally use things like ECL to create that list. So do you see any more questions, Liara?
Yes, we have a question. Following MIT model, SNOMED should offer all course materials and PDF excluding the question bank. This would help entrepreneurs to refer to the structured learning, and the follow-up was added during the application development. So that is a suggestion. But with regards to the questions, the question we have at the moment is, do learning pathways for developers and or data analysts include terminology services related to APIs?
So those pathways don't, but you can freely go on the terminology services course, which does cover that. But actually that's a certification exam, so that might be a payment for that because you have the certification as well. But there is a terminology service course to cover the API side of things.
Okay. And then to address a question from Rachel regarding availability of slides, we trust that the slides will be made available and that will be communicated to attendees after the expo where you can find them. But that is the intention.
I definitely think the recordings will be available on YouTube as well.
Right, that's correct, yeah. So information with links will be shared.
And part of Abdul's question was also the difference between stated and inferred relationships. So a stated relationship is how an author has modeled the concept. But we do that in such a way that we allow then the classifier. So then we, once we've modeled the concept, it's classified, and the classifier decides through description logic which parent which part of the hierarchy it will sit and which parents it has. So the difference between stated and inferred is stated is how it's been modeled by the author, and the inferred view is how it's released and how it looks in the hierarchy once it's been classified. So rather than us deciding what part of the hierarchy it goes in, the classifier, using description logic, makes that decision for us by classifying it and place it in the hierarchy.
Okay, if the audience has more questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box and type them in. Okay, so at this point, we don't have any questions coming in. So we would like to thank you for your time listening to the tutorials and the presentation. And if you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask during the course of the Expo, please feel free to connect with us via the meeting hub. And thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the Expo. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.